Dr. Roberts, let me ask you this. Here we are far along now into this crisis that's been happening in the Ukraine. I think you've written about the fact that the rebels, the people claim are Russian supplied, could have destroyed the Ukrainian army numerous times, but the saga still lives on. What's going to happen there, and what about Washington's position against Russia? Where are we?
We're in scary times because the neoconservative ideology, which rules American foreign policy and military policy, says that the first objective of American foreign policy is to prevent the rise of Russia. And so if that's your first objective, then you have to prevent Russia's rise. In other words, you're committed to war, because if you can't do it with sanctions, or you can't do it by causing a coup in Ukraine. Ukraine was part of Russia for a couple of centuries. The Ukraine's been part of Russia longer than the United States has existed. It became independent only in the 1990s when Washington insisted and extracted it out of Russia with the Soviet collapse. So they try a coup there. They'll try the same thing in the former Soviet Central Asian republics like Kyrgyzstan, Uzbekistan. They'll create all this propaganda about Russia's going to attack Poland. Russia's going to attack the Baltics. They'll build up all these military bases, and troops, and propaganda, hoping to knuckle Russia under and make them agree to comply with American foreign policy. But they're not going to do it. Russians are not going to comply. And so unless Washington becomes realistic, which I don't think is possible, or the neoconservatives lose their hold. I mean, perhaps if Trump got in there, or Bernie Sanders, maybe they would clean out these people. I don't know that they would, but it's possible. We know for sure that none of the other candidates would. Unless something like that happens, we're on the road to war. And we've talked before, Eric, that the other thing that could save us would be for the Europeans to finally realize that it does not pay them to be such vassals of Washington that they can be lined up into conflict with Russia, because they have nothing to gain from that. And if there is a war, Europe will be completely obliterated. That'll be the first thing that happens. Europe just will disappear off the face of the earth. So possibly the bought and paid for European politicians who get their bagfuls of money from Washington could come to the conclusion that the bagfuls of money aren't worth the death of Europe. And they might say, hey, we've had enough, we're not going along with this. And if they don't go along with it, Washington can't push the issue. It's got to have Europe as an enabler to bring conflict to Russia. So it's not impossible that these people won't see what's happening to them, and the Europeans won't see what's happening to them, and say, hey, no, we're not part of this anymore. This is it. Sanctions are off. We're out of NATO. And then it would all halt. But it's going to take some major thing like that.
Dr. Roberts, let me ask you this. How do you think this will all end? You put out some scenarios, but what do you really expect to happen?
I think that conflict gets out of hand, and Washington is pushing conflict so hard. In fact, Washington takes tremendous risk. Take this Malaysian airline on MH17. It's obvious that the Russians and the so-called breakaway republics had nothing whatsoever to do with the downing of their airliner. We know this for many reasons, and the most obvious reason is that the report that's supposed to have been issued by the Dutch, who are the principal people investigating this, can't get released because Washington is blocking it. Instead of the report getting released, Washington leaks to the Western media that the report has concluded that Russia shot down the plane, or that these breakaway republics supported by Russia shot down the plane. And so you keep seeing these stories, these leaks. And then the Dutch investigators, they stand up and they refute the leaks. They say, no, we've not made any such conclusion. but the denials don't get the coverage that the accusations get. And so Washington is sort of getting more and more people to think the Russians are involved because they leak what they claim is the report, but they won't allow the report to be released. And now what are they doing? Washington says, now we'll really set the Russians up. What we'll do, we'll get Malaysia to go to the UN and ask for a UN tribunal to investigate. And this will come before the Security Council, and Russia will have to veto it because Russia will know that it's a setup, that it's going to be a show trial of Russia to find them guilty. They know that, so they'll have to veto it. And when they veto it, we can say, see, they're afraid of the truth. They're against justice for the Malaysians, blah, blah, blah. And that's exactly what happened. It's exactly what's happened. So when you see Washington this determined to create an environment based entirely on lies, then you have to assume that the risk of war is extremely great because there's no restraint on Washington. They've no restraint. And I think Washington is making the mistake of interpreting the Russian diplomacy, Putin's diplomacy, as weakness. Because Washington doesn't use diplomacy. It uses coercion. It uses force. It doesn't negotiate. It gives orders. It puts pressure. It puts sanctions. It uses force. And the Russian response has been, let's talk about this. So look, here's our point of view. What's your point of view? How can we come to some sort of resolution of this? And Washington looks at that as a weakness. So they're convinced that Russia is weak and won't fight and will eventually back down and be knuckled under. Well, that's a mistake. They will not. So that's how you get wars. You see what I'm saying? It's not, Washington is making all kinds of miscalculations. And they're so used to lying and getting away with it. Look, you remember Saddam Hussein's weapons of mass destruction? Colin Powell, the former four-star general, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the Secretary of State, and he goes to the UN and lies through his teeth? Now, who's ever paid any consequences for that? Nobody. Colin Powell later said, I didn't realize how badly I was being used, and I'm ashamed of it, and I regret it, and it's a blot on my career, but I didn't know the bastards would treat their own Secretary of State that way, giving me all this false information to take to the UN. But the UN has never called Bush or the Bush administration up there or the American ambassador and said, what in the world? How dare you? How dare you? They've never done anything about it. We know for a fact now that Saddam Hussein had no weapons of mass destruction. Even George W. Bush himself has now admitted that. And yet nothing has been done about the fact that we destroyed an entire country, killed 1 million people, displaced 4 million, all sorts of people maimed, orphaned, widowed, birth defects everywhere from the ordnance that the Americans used. But nothing happens. There's no consequences. So Washington says, well, we can tell any lie we want, but nobody does anything about it. The idiot Americans believe them. They believe these lies. No matter how many times we tell them lies, and it turns out they're lies, they believe the next one too. Well, that makes a government reckless. It's arrogant, hubris. Well, that's not the way you want to be with the Russians. They're not any kind of a easy knockover. Just go ask Adolf Hitler or Napoleon. Mucking around with them this way is a surefire guarantee of war.